Hey there, thinking reporters. Welcome back to another episode of the Start Thinking Forward podcast. I'm your host, Brennan L. Draper, and today we got something truly special for you. Are you a startup, founder, investor, or simply someone intrigued by the world of entrepreneurship? Well, you're in for a treat today. We have not one, but two award-winning professors from Indiana University of Kelley School of Business, Dr. Todd and Kim Saxon. They're here to drop some serious knowledge and bombs on how to navigate the treacherous waters of the startup life. They've advised hundreds of startups, invested game-changing ventures, and authored The Titanic Effect, the most read guide for anyone in the startup ecosystem. So fasten your seatbelts, grab your notebooks, and let's dive deep into the secrets of startup success and how to steer close to those deadly icebergs. So, Kim, Todd, welcome to the Start Thinking Forward podcast. I'm glad you're here. We had an interesting little conversation before we started here. Tell us a little bit more, because, a couple of words that I read cannot, summate who you guys are, what you've done, and what you're about, and what brought you here today. Can you share a little bit of insight with me?
Well, first, Brandon, I have to laugh because you use the word deep dive, and Todd often uses scuba metaphors as he's talking about startups and students learning about startups. And I'm going to let him tell you why.
Yeah, so we did scuba certification. And, when you're learning scuba, they don't just take you out in the ocean and throw you overboard, right? And say, here's your gear. You start by learning simple things in the pool, how to take a mask on and off, how to breathe underwater, all that kind of stuff. But then you eventually get to the point where you do that deep dive, right? You go out, and that's what makes it fun. And when you're ready to jump off in the startup world, you have to recognize there are a lot of resources around you, like this podcast. If you're going to be a forward thinker, make sure you're equipping yourself with the tools to survive that plunge. And believe me, once you get there, it is a whole different world. It is wonderful to be under the water and seeing everything. But you jump into it without the right preparedness, and you're military, Brandon. You know what? Like, you don't just jump into a firefight. You're right. In advance, what terrain you're facing, who the enemies are, and so a lot of our work has been, we roll up our sleeves and have done what we can to help start companies and invest in them. But our passion and what we are about is helping educate the entrepreneurs, the future entrepreneurs, the forward thinkers, to be able to accomplish their dreams and move forward. So it's a pleasure and an honor to be here with your audience and sharing whatever we can with you.
Kim, you got anything to share about that? Or?
Well, I think he summed it up. Even for us, it's hard to take the plunge. I mean, we've had a couple of opportunities where we could have, been in the middle of a functioning startup, and we've chosen to advise them. So we do understand the risks of the plunge and why understanding what's going on is so critical.
Okay, in today's age, I mean, every couple of minutes, it seems like every day you go online, you see that there's someone creating a new venture, a new startup. Can you walk us through like the critical phases that every startup goes through, and why understanding these stages is vital for any founder if they want to be successful?
Yeah, so I'm going to grab this one. And let me say, first of all, people think that some of these startups are overnight successes. And, if you talk to a quote unquote overnight success, they'll say it was the longest 10 years overnight they ever experienced. It takes time. People don't realize how much has happened for what now looks like an overnight success. And that's one of the things we call in the book, is that you have to really be thinking about the startup and stage appropriate issues in 4 big phases that we like to talk about. So the first one is just pre-revenue, when you're still developing your ideas. Some startups spend a long time in pre-revenue because there's the beginning of an idea. You go and you do some customer discovery and discover that is not really the right idea. You maybe get as far as having a product, but then you can't sell it to anybody. So then you have a pivot. So that whole, I'm thinking about something. It might be this, it might be that. I'm not really sure. Could be anywhere from a very short period of time, months, to, multiple years, depending on who the entrepreneur is and what the idea is. But eventually you land on a minimally viable product that people are willing to pay for. Right. So if not, then you need to exit. Right. So you can only spend so much time planning. Eventually you have to have something. And then that gets you to the place where you are, really still early. You've got a handful of customers. And we always like to say, like, it's a big deal when you sell to the first stranger. And maybe it's not that hard to sell to people. I'm not saying it's easy, but it's not that hard. The first time your product ends up in a stranger's hand, like our book in your hand, because we didn't know you at all, right? It's a pretty cool moment. And once you have that, then you can begin to build the third stage, which is a replicable product. And that leads to the fourth stage, which is scaling. And scaling is all about putting fewer resources in and getting higher sales out. So up until now, we've talked about a lot of costly things, figuring out what to do, starting to build a product. When you get your first customers, you typically are not making money on them. Most startups don't end up being cash flow neutral. They're still a sucking machine. They need dollars. At some point, you can start to scale where the dollars coming out are bigger than the dollars going in. And that's really exciting.
I'll just add a couple things to that too. One, I think people, including potentially some members of your audience, have this idea that you have to go through all four of those stages to be a successful entrepreneur, that you have to have that scalable venture and go raise venture capital and, do that A round to 10, 20 million plus. And the reality is our economy is based on hundreds of thousands, millions of companies that don't need venture capital, don't need to go out and do that big fundraise, and are very worthwhile businesses. So don't get sucked into the, kind of the press image that, oh, here's what a successful entrepreneur does. If you are able to leave your job and be self-employed and maybe keep a few other people employed working with you, that is wonderful. And you can add a lot of value and have a lot of meaning in doing that without feeling that need to go raise millions of dollars. If that's what you're about, that's great, right? And we all benefit hopefully from these scalable technologies and the companies you read about, right? The Facebooks, et cetera. But don't feel like you have to be that venture to be successful. And then the other thing, which will pull us back a little bit more to the Titanic, and as you're moving through the phases Kim was talking about, at each of those stages, we encourage founders to kind of think through what we call the 3 Ps, right? The first one is punt. Like, it's okay to say, yeah, I had that idea and I got out there and started to get some feedback, and it's wrong. It's not the right fit. It's, I'm not going to get traction. Pull the plug. It's okay. Move on to the next thing. The second is, I'm still passionate about this, and I think I got the problem right. I didn't have the right solution, or maybe I didn't have the right market segment. So that's what we call pivot, right? That's where you change direction to accommodate the market feedback, but you're still moving forward. Or under an ideal world, you get to that magic combination where you have proof of concept, you have fit between what you're creating and the customer that you're serving, and then you proceed. So those are our 3 Ps. And you should be intentional. You should put that in your calendar. The last Friday of the month, I'm going to have that 3P conversation with myself, with my advisor. Is it time to pull the plug? Do I need to change direction, or can I keep moving forward and be productive?
It's a funny thing you mentioned the punt. I got an email today from a business I've been working with for 5 years, and it was thank you so much for your help, and we've decided to pass our IP over to a university.
Drop 10 and punt.
So, I mean, and I know it's not on the agenda, but it's kind of when you were talking, Todd, and you added to those points. One of the things that I think a lot of times people don't talk about is what they consider that concept of a lean startup. But I don't want to negate by saying lean startup. Like, there are certain things that I consider what we call non-negotiables. Like, even though you may be a lean startup, there are certain things that is non-negotiable. Either you're going to do these things and be successful, or you're not, and you're not going to be able to proceed at anything. You're not going to be able to pivot or punt, right? So
Yep.
Can you share a little bit more insight about where a general startup that maybe have the resources to be able to get the financing, going through all the series, and getting angel investors or venture capitals involved in their business? Talk a little bit about that, but then also talk about the lean startup and the difference between the two, and what are some of the things that, even if you're being lean, you cannot escape from unless you're not going to be successful in business and your startup.
I'm happy to take a first shot at that, Kim, if that's all right with you. So,
Well, yeah,
I want to
Kim,
contrast what is the lean startup versus like what's the alternative. And the alternative is, in some cases, what we taught in universities, 20, 30 years ago, which is the business plan. And you sit in your dorm room and go to the library and you create this 200-page document. That's your roadmap for how your startup is going to be successful. And you spend a lot of time on developing the product. And have you talked to a customer yet? Oh, no, we're not ready. It's going to take another year or two to do that. Well, like, compared to that, the lean startup makes a ton of sense, right? Go out there, get feedback. Now, does that mean you're not thoughtful and intentional about how your decisions in marketing affect your finances? And I'll give a quick example of that. We've run across, I can't count them on two hands, or even both Kim and my hands, where the finance person part of the team put together the projections and the funding needs, and the marketing side of the team put the sales and marketing plan together with a 3-month free pilot. All right. 3-month free pilot. Guess what that means on the funding side? You're not getting dollars in the door probably for 6 months, right? Because your customers have 90+ days of payment. So the finance person, it has this great plan about how you only need to raise, $800,000 to get launched and traction. Meanwhile, the marketing person is selling this 3-month free pilot, and there's a 6-month disconnect between cash flow and cash needs, right? And like, that's what you uncover when you are thoughtful about connecting the pieces of what normally would be viewed as a business plan. And I think the whole lean up startup, which we're big fans of that idea of having hypotheses, going out and testing them in the marketplace, get feedback from the market sooner. Big supporters of all of that, but you have to be doing it intentionally. It should be hypothesis driven. You have an idea about what you think is going to work, and then you get the feedback. And if you're going to pivot, that's what you do accordingly. So what you want to avoid is what we call kind of the pinball entrepreneur, right? That every bit of feedback, you're bouncing to the other side, and you're jumping all over the place, and you're really not committed to the problem that you're solving or the market that you're solving it for. And you need to have one of your feet planted in either what problem are you solving or who are you solving it for. That is technically what a pivot is in basketball, right? You've got one foot planted, and then you're changing another component.
So, Brand, I just want to jump in and say this is my pet peeve about the lean startup. I really think it's, as Todd said, it's elegant. It gets people out. You don't spend too much time over planning. But here's the thing. You need to have a hypothesis. I mean, the whole aspect of product market fit is a hypothesis. A hypothesis is typically a scientific process. I think it's going to be A or B, right? So let me go run a test and see what happens. When I see people and they're doing lean startup, they rarely actually have identified what are the results of the test. So let's go talk to people. What are our expectations? Are we going to see 20%, 50%, 70%? What percent of people do we need to see that have this problem for us to think this is a worthwhile problem? Okay. And how much are they going to have to pay? Do we care about $100, $1,000, $10,000? Write it down. So many people, quote unquote, are hypothesis testing without having written their actual expected results and what decision they're going to make. And I see this all the time with A/B tests. And then what they do is an A/B test says change one thing. All right, let's say it's an email. Just only change the subject line. Well, that never happens. They change the subject line and who it's from and what the image is. Well, that's not a clean test, right?
Yeah.
So
a different way,
key.
we sometimes talk about it that, lean startup is not a free license for lean thinking, or in a less kind way, being stupid.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. So one of the books by Jim Collins is called Good to Great. I don't know if you guys ever read that.
Absolutely.
So a couple of years ago, and this is interesting, this was like right before the pandemic, but there was a company that came out, was called Quibi. And it was this idea that, and it was a failure. They had gotten a lot of money, they had raised a lot of money, got all these big name people to perform, but kind of mentioned what you said earlier, 90 days, if you could create an account and use that app for 90 days free of charge. And then when they finally came time for them to roll out, there was a message saying, hey, it's over with, we're done. I was like, what? Like,
This
ran out of
money
already.
business, right?
It was a great idea. They had the funding. Think about it. So this is a startup. They had the funding. It was a good idea, but did they really find out what people wanted? Like, yeah, I mean, looking at a 3 minute, 4 minute, basically took a movie, a long movie, and broke it down into bite size. I mean, it's a great idea, I think. But did they ask the consumer, would you be willing or wanting to digest content at 2-3 minutes at a time? Would that work for you? And I don't think that question was ever asked. It was, we got a great idea. There's other, video on demand platforms out there. We got money. We got the actors and actresses. Let's go ahead and launch it. But it became an epic failure before it even could launch really fully.
I think we just fell in love with the Bunny Stew movies. Like, you ever see the Bunny Stew Jaws? And they fell in love with that concept and just didn't think it through, right?
But this is one where we have a lot of data that could have helped them think about it. I mean, for example, we've been trained to watch TV for 15 minutes, right? And almost all of us can wait 15 minutes to get something to eat or to get a drink or, whatever it is. So why would you think 3 minutes is the right bandwidth, right? Our whole culture has been taught 15 minutes.
I think they were trying to mimic that social media concept, and it's a different type of attention. Like if I'm on my phone looking at social media, it's a different type of attention when I'm looking at a TV. But they're thinking that, well, now the phone is now the new TV. I'm not
but let me
to that.
tell you what my biggest fear for the movie theaters is, right? I don't know if you've been to a movie lately, like you and the other two people who are in the theater. You're like, look at all the flushed at this moment with us all being in a theater. And why is that? Well, that's because we're used to watching our movies in our home, where we can stop every 15 minutes like we've been trained and go to the bathroom and get a drink. Imagine if the movie theater paused it every, I don't know, half an hour or something. Or, we used to have theaters, plays, whatever. They have an intermission. But now if you go to the theater, you're like strapped in that seat for that X amount of time with no opportunity to do anything else. And then they're like, well, I don't know why people aren't coming to the theater. Well, I don't know, because the theater doesn't really fit us anymore.
I don't know, though. Maybe with baseball, if they made a game 3 minutes, like they've already shortened it, right? Speed it up.
Don't be mean. So when it comes to like unveiling, because you guys, the book that you wrote, the Titanic, so you're talking about unveiling the icebergs, common pitfalls in startups. That these things can sink startups easily. What are some of the most frequent and obstacles in startups encounter, and how could they be sidestepped?
Yeah, and just rewinding a little bit, zooming out, that the whole idea of the book came from our cumulative experience and our co-author Michael Cloran, who's a serial tech founder, and you just see these patterns over and over that very smart, very well-intentioned entrepreneurs make, simply because they don't know, right? They didn't understand where the pitfalls might be. So what we tried to do was kind of categorize them. We did some presentations to the startup and early stage investor community, and kind of landed on this idea that it's a lot like an iceberg, right? What you see is only about 10% of the total volume. So there's a lot below the surface. And as Kim will attest, I'm like the naming guy, right? And I'm like, oh, think about icebergs, you think about the Titanic. So wouldn't it be cool if we called it the Titanic effect? And she fortunately was smart and disciplined enough to say, yeah, we probably should do some research around that before we name it. So I'll turn it over to you, Kim.
Yeah, so I started doing research and we realized that just like everybody thinks that hitting the iceberg is what sunk the Titanic, it really wasn't. There was a combination of decisions that, because they were trying to do something so amazingly new, they had the largest ship ever that they were building. They built 3 of them at the same time. They wanted this one to be luxurious, so they made design changes to make it luxurious. And it turns out that those decisions interact with each other. And it was the combination that was probably deadly, as opposed to simply, having a hole in the side of the boat. Don't get me wrong, having a hole in the side of the boat is very bad. But the same thing is what we tried to call out are these 32 mistakes that we were seeing over and over again. And we kind of divided them up into oceans, using that sort of ocean metaphor. And so we have the human ocean, the things that you do with your co-founders and employees and investors, the marketing ocean, which is, all about how you design the product and try to sell it. And then we have the technology ocean, which is how do you actually start to build the product. And finally, we have the strategy ocean, which is the combination of those things. And so we can kind of identify what is probably the biggest mistake or iceberg in each of those oceans. I'll take the marketing one. We commonly refer to the customer value void. So we name these as bad things, right? Which is that, just as we were talking earlier, you have some idea, you go out, you try and offer it. And the reality is that most people do not change their behavior. They do exactly tomorrow what they were doing today. So you have to have something that is so important to them and fills a problem that they have, so that they are willing to pay for it. And so you can come up with all kinds of amazing ideas, but if it's not an idea that solves a problem that people are willing to pay for, then it's going to be really hard to be a success.
So, yeah, and I wasn't trying to dodge the question, Brandon, with kind of backtrack into the whole origin of the naming, et cetera. But I think in terms of framing, like what are some of those big mistakes, or what are some of the big Detbergs or icebergs that they hit? Kim covered one in the marketing area, and I'll cover a couple others that often happen in those earlier stages, the pre-revenue or going toward launch. And one we call the overdo and overspend, which is, and it's related to the value void, but on the technical side, you have this idea of the product you want to build. You're ready to go out and spend, $150,000 to get your app to market. But you haven't done enough exploration, develop the MVP to get market feedback, see how people are actually going to use it or break it, that allow you to spend the money in the right way. So, and that'll circle back to technical debt, which we'll probably talk about later. In the human ocean that we talk about, so these are the relationships that you build with co-founders, with investors, advisors, eventually employees. And, we all kind of have this in our mind, at least, about the 3 founders that get together over a beer and come up with this great idea of a 3-minute baseball game. And then the 3 of us say, this is really cool. Let's split it a third, and we'll move forward, right? With no idea who's going to do the heavy lifting on making that venture actually happen. When Todd is going to move into a different sport and take up soccer instead, and you guys left on your own, kind of moving the venture forward. And I still have a third of the business. So that overcommitting equity too early. So you want to make sure you vest that equity, meaning people have to earn it over time as they actually accomplish goals and contribute to the business. And you also don't want to allocate 100% of the equity to those founders. You want to leave some set aside, because as smart as the 3 of us are, we probably have some gaps that we could fill through bringing in co-founders or other people. So those are some of the ones, as it mentioned, in the human and the technical C.
So what I'm hearing a little bit from you, Todd, is like definitely as a founder, be looking for that sweet equity, like, sweat equity.
Yeah.
Where, hey, what you put in is what you're going to get out. We're not going to just give it just because you said, hey, I'm here. That's going to be dependent on that work that each individual puts in, that they can get some of that sweat equity and be able to have a part of the company as a result of their efforts that they're putting into the company.
That's right. To get that equity, you got to sweat.
Well, I have a great example. So when we launched the book, we did a talk out at Uber in San Francisco, and a brand new entrepreneur who was a Kelly alum was there, and he was talking about his brand new venture and how excited he was. And then about 3 weeks ago, he posted on LinkedIn that the venture was 4 years old and his equity finally vested, and he has earned the equity that he started out where he had 100%, but he still doesn't have 100%, but at least he has all that he was guaranteed at the beginning. And that's great. That means the business has had 4 years to really figure out product market fit and start to move to that scalable side. And they're scaling really nicely. And so, I mean, we're like all clapping because you want to see those. You want to see people talking about invest over 4 years. I mean, when you join a big company, you don't get your pension either. You have to wait 4 or 5 years to get your pension. What makes you think that the minute you start doing a startup that you should get all the equity?
Yeah, exactly. So uncertainty quagmire, that's the that's the punchline, because uncertainty is a constant, companion when you're starting a startup. I mean, it's like, it's going to be there next, like, reminding you, like, hey, we don't know if this is going to work or not, but keep on pushing, losing money every day, So it becomes a companion for a lot of startups. How can founders like identify, manage, and mitigate the various types of uncertainties that may come their way when they're doing this startup?
It's a great question, and one of our favorite topics, because there's some serious science behind it, which we think actually is really cool, but there are also some real practical kind of implications for that. So you'll often hear the press and others talk about entrepreneurship as being risky, right? And people say, I'm risk averse, so I'm not going to start a company. And risk and uncertainty are actually very different constructs. So risk is analytical. It's mostly frontal lobe, so it's the frontal part of the brain that activates. And when you think about risk, you can do an assessment because you know the possible outcomes, and you might even know the distribution of possible outcomes. So think about games of like dice or cards, right? If you're rolling dice, you know it unless the dice are real funny, it's going to be between a 2 and a 12, and you know your chances of rolling a 7 are higher than your chance of rolling a 2 or a 12. And people who are risk averse won't even bet on dice, or if they do, they'll put a small amount of money on a 7. Whereas somebody else might be, let the whole thing roll on a 12 and we'll see what happens. That's a very different phenomenon than navigating that quagmire of uncertainty, where you don't know the range of distribution of outcomes. You don't know how much money this thing could possibly lose, how many jobs could eventually be created. And it's a different part of your brain, more that fight or flight kind of component. So if you can start to acquaint yourself with tools to navigate that uncertainty, you can move it more toward a rational decision-making process. And that's part of what we were trying to do in the book, is to say, hey, if you can start mapping this and you can start identifying in advance where those areas of uncertainty are going to come from, you can win. You can navigate this. And it's not rolling the dice. It's not just saying, I don't know, should I put $100,000 of my savings on this? I'll roll the dice. No, you should not be thinking that way.
Exactly. And we try to identify where the sources of uncertainty are going to be. I mean, some of those are going to be, what kind of employee should we hire? What kind of skills do we need now? We try to map out the type of skills by stage. What are our major marketing activities? Hey, do we want to be like super unique, or do we want to fit into a well-known category and be able to differentiate ourselves? How can we take on the technological development in a steady progression instead of jumping out the door with this very expensive product right off the bat? We have a startup that we support that has a piece of hardware, and we still debate with ourselves if we should be investing in hardware because there's so many changes that have to happen. And even in our 3 years of using this product, we've seen, they break. Oh, well, that didn't work the way we thought it would. Right. And so we know the kinds of things as you're pushing the envelope, of trying to do things that have never been done before. We do know where those vulnerabilities are.
Yeah, and I want to come back actually to Quibi and that example, which I think is very powerful. And, people get in their heads like everything needs to be disrupted. And to me, that's an example. We're like, yeah, some things are really hard to disrupt, like Theranos and their blood test, right? 1 drop of blood, and we can do 100 plus tests. Well, okay, does healthcare need to be disrupted? Absolutely. Does it need to be disrupted with bad science and lying to investors and employees? Probably not, right? So let's be a little more thoughtful about how we disrupt and when there's an opportunity to do that in the right way.
Todd, I mean that's on time. That's a statement that should be reverberated all over everywhere, because a lot of people don't understand it. Everybody wants to, like you said, is be this disruptor, be this disruptor. Why? Like, people want to be different for the sake of being different, not being authentically different. What is the purpose? What is the reason behind doing this? No, I just want to be a disruptor and make money. Like what? Like what's the logic in that? Any more? You want to say something on that, Kim?
No, I think you're really right. And this is one of those things I hear all the time with my MBA classes is students are like, we want the first mover advantage. Oh, really? I mean, have you ever done any research or seen what the research about first movers is? Second mover usually wins, right? So you basically just taught the market where it was going, and then somebody else is going to come along and do it better. So
the other one we love is blue ocean, right? We're going to disrupt and be in the blue ocean. Haven't we even seen one shark movie? You know what it's like to be out there in the middle of the blue ocean and you're by yourself? No.
Yeah. It's funny. See land. I always envision people like in one of those little inner tubes for floating down the river, but they're just floating out at sea.
It's funny. They always talk about pioneers. Like, yeah, they're always first, but they got a whole bunch of arrows in their back. So, I'm a strong believer that, there's no mission if there's no money, right? And you guys talk about something that, to me, I think any startup is almost like the heart of the business. It's like, they talk about the silent killer, cholesterol or whatever. I think it's cholesterol. I don't know if I'm right, but it's a silent killer. So when you're talking about technical debt, that silent killer. So my question is, what are some like innovative strategies for minimizing technical debt, right, during product development, and why is this so crucial?
Yeah. So the funny thing about technical debt is because we were working with a software serial entrepreneur. That's kind of where this whole thing started. Is he was always talking about technical debt and what are the steps you can take in software development to reduce technical debt, which basically goes to really envisioning where the product's going to end up and work backwards to a minimally viable product, as opposed to just starting from nothing and say, what's the least that we have to do? We want to do it, actually think fully fledged. What's the most that we want to do and pare it back, because it's really hard if you've done the least to add on to it. And our thought was, well, the same thing is happening in the marketing arena, that the early choice creates a debt that has to be serviced. And in your choice of employees and founders, likewise, you take on a debt that has to be serviced. So the whole book is really based on this concept of technical debt. So we talked a little bit about in technology, what to do is really get a great sense of what the product ultimately is going to be, and then pare it back to a minimally viable product. But what we often see is in marketing is you're not really sure who the right customer is. And so sometimes I hear things like, everybody needs this product. Really, anybody could be a customer. And I mean, this is taking on marketing debt, because you as a startup, you can't service everyone or anyone. You actually have to be really laser focused and say the perfect people for this product. We call it segments. Identify your ideal segment and focus just on them. And for startups, this feels really awful. They feel like, oh my gosh, I'm leaving somebody out. It's absolutely critical. If you don't have a hypothesis, I think this is the best target. And here are 2 or 3 other choices. Let's test this one. Let's be ready to pivot over here and possibly over there. Then, that's just a huge debt. It's just a marketing debt, not a technical debt.
And I want to talk a little bit more about some ways to mitigate without getting too much in the weeds with it. But part of the discipline of that avoiding technical debt is, as Kim said, you want to start with what are we building, right? What's the big picture? But then you're breaking that into a discrete set of activities or sprints. Maybe it's 1 to 2 weeks where the team is saying, what can we accomplish in 2 weeks? What's going to cause that next positive inflection point on product development? Well, that's exactly what the whole startup should be doing. How much money do we need? How many people do we need? What do we need to learn about our market and build that product to get to the next inflection point for the organization, so we can start selling shit, so we can start, getting money in the door, or we can go out and raise that next round or whatever that case may be. And if you set up that mindset of shorter term targets and bursts of activity to get to that next inflection point, that's something that you can carry with you for a long time. But then periodically stepping back and looking at the big picture, we call it the nail the next and the navigation, that you need to spend some time on navigation. That's stepping back and thinking about the whole journey, but that's maybe half a day a week. Most of your time is spent on what you're doing now and what you're doing next. Who's our current customer? What's our current fire we need to put out? And there are always fires. And then what's the next one, so we can anticipate and help address that? Who are our next customers? Who are our next hires to be able to fulfill our promises to our stakeholders?
Yeah.
Okay,
so
that's the now, the next, and the what? I'm sorry, Kim.
The navigation. That's kind of the strategy.
Navigation. Okay.
It actually comes from mountain biking. So I don't know if you're a mountain biker, we are, but we got that in camp in Utah a couple years ago, where it was like, the now is like, you don't want to step into a cactus, or even worse, a snake, right? So you always got to know what's underfoot, because it's not unusual for you to have to take a foot off and recover. But you also need to look at the next, right? Because there's a lot of bends and a lot of cliffs, and you want to be able to anticipate that and steer in the right direction. But then that navigation piece is, you need to know if you're going for a 1 hour or 5 hour, because if you're in Moab, it's hot, it's dry. You need to know if you need to take, 60 ounces of Gatorade or a water bottle.
Kim?
Yeah. So what I was going to say is the issue of milestones, as he talked about, like sprints. I mean, the issue is by thinking in each dimension of the business, the product itself, the employees, the funding, the customer. You have to have these in bite-sized pieces with milestones. And it's always frustrating to us when we talk to startups and A, they don't have any milestones, or B, they have milestones and they aren't meeting any of them. Right. So like, if you don't have milestones, how do you know where you're going? There's a startup we've been working with for a couple of years. And I mean, first revenue has moved from like the third quarter of 22 to the fourth quarter of 23 to now the first quarter of 25. I'm like, really? Are you moving forward?
Exactly.
I mean, we're talking about first revenue.
Yeah, exactly. So it seems like when you're talking about, this technical debt, that being a silent killer, the next thing is really, it's kind of the same. I'm not going to say same thing, but it's like, you don't know, like I just recently had a conversation with the idea of, you don't know that you have a problem if you're not even measuring certain things. Like if you're not taking a measure of things, it's hard for you to determine that you actually have a problem. And that's kind of like going with the DEI, type stuff. But there's hidden liabilities that, potential startups can have, right? Can you dive a little bit into that concept of what those hidden debts or costs could be? Those, non-financial obligations that startups often overlook, but like you said, it can be detrimental.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'd love to give an example from the Titanic that I think makes this pretty clear.
Absolutely.
So, for example, when they first designed the Titanic, they actually had planned to put enough lifeboats for all of the passengers that they intended to sell to. But because they want to be so luxurious, and we're talking about like $100,000 room kind of a thing, so like pretty luxurious in our terms, nobody wants to look out the window and look at lifeboats, do they? So we take the lifeboats out. And as it turned out, it kind of would have worked because they didn't sell out the boat, that they actually had enough lifeboats that they could have loaded people into all the lifeboats. But here's where the other liability came around. Everything the Titanic was so new, and from an engineering perspective was so unknown, so uncertain, that only 5% of the employees on the Titanic were trained seamen. This is a problem if you need to load lifeboats efficiently, right? So those are the liabilities that we're talking about. It's not that taking out the lifeboats necessarily was a bad choice. It just turns out to be a bad choice if you have a wreck and you don't have employees who know how to load the lifeboats. Those were liabilities that were taken on, each one independently without understanding the cumulative effects. You want to add that?
Yeah. I think you hit it very well. So, but yeah, that framework of technical debt is what led us to this whole series. Now, I feel like this legal asterisk where I'm going to speak real fast saying, but it's important. We are not talking about legal liabilities, and that is beyond our area of expertise. We don't address it in the book, and it is a really important thing to consider, including legal liability, like insurance if something goes wrong, et cetera. So we talk about metaphorically the idea of liabilities and these hidden debts, but there's an ocean, the legal ocean, that we ignore. It's not on our globe, and we apologize for that. But again, not our area of expertise, and not something we have here, but something that all of your listeners should be aware of.
But what I want to point out is that just like to grow as a person, you might have to take on debt, right? You want to go back to school and get educated. That's going to take on some debt. You want to buy a house. You're going to take on some debt. Startups have to take on this debt. They have to have these liabilities because of the uncertainty. They don't know where they're going. The problem is that they forget, right? So you forget that you took out the lifeboats and you don't have enough people to load them, right? So one of the things, we actually sell maps from our framework because it's like, hey, which icebergs have you taken on? Like map them back to you watch it, just make a list. And we work with some board of directors and to look at, well, what are the liabilities that we have, the debts we've taken on? Are we servicing our debts? Are we mitigating our debts? Are we just letting them sit there?
It's kind of interesting. I like Todd when you said earlier, saying that, hey, we're not experts. That's not our field. But in the military, in the Army, they had this thing called an azimuth. An azimuth gives you a direction to go. Like, hey, I'm gonna go 1,000 meters at a 75-degree azimuth. At that point, I should reach to my point. You may not have all the information dealing with that, but you're shooting people in the right direction. Like, hey, if you're a startup, this is a non-negotiable. You need to find that information out so that you don't hit an iceberg unexpectedly. Like, well, I didn't know I needed X, Y, Z. Well, if you're listening to this show right now, we're telling you do. And there's a way of getting that information. You have to be willing to be intentional and reaching out to the right folks to find that information out. And we have two experts here, Kim and Todd, Saxon. And I'm gonna throw you guys' stuff again up here so people can look. So they got the book. Kim or Todd, can you talk real quick about this book again? Because I want to emphasize, if someone went through something for 10, 20 years and they became a subject matter expert and they wrote a book on it, and you could pick that book up and relatively within, an evening, I'm pretty sure you can read this book within a couple of days or a day if you really committed to it. and have all this information, why wouldn't you do it? So, Todd, Kim.
Yeah, so our idea with this book was to make it very practical. So I think, there's a lot of information in there. And so we tried to get the balance between giving you examples. There are a lot of startup stories in there. So we really researched a lot of stories to provide some examples, but also there's just enough sort of things out of a textbook that instead of just saying, hey, this is a problem, you should watch out for it, we say, hey, this is a problem and here's how you fix it. Here's what you need to think about. So we try to make it very practical to allow people to really analyze where they are and strategize what they need to do next.
And hopefully it's a little bit entertaining. You learn a little bit about the Titanic and history of the White Star Line, which, by the way, is actually super cool and fun to be able to draw on. Do not convince yourself, and we are far from saying this book makes it easy to start a successful venture, because that is not the case. We would not make that promise. But what I will promise you is this. I'll tell you, we've listened to dozens of audiobooks frequently. That's how we consume this kind of content, is, on a road trip or something, and we'll listen and read, similar numbers of books. And at least half of them, you read the first chapter and then you get into chapter 4 and you're like, aren't they just saying the same thing they said in chapter 1? So we were very deliberate in trying to make sure that each chapter provided some unique value. And we hope we accomplished that. And people who have embraced it seem to feel that way. But yeah, and it's there. We're also here and reachable. So
yeah, so one Saturday we're doing some work at our computers, because that's what professors do. We work all the time now. There's no set time frame. And we get this email from somebody who's like, oh, hey, I just finished reading your book and I wonder, can we get together for lunch? Because I want to talk about this, that, and the other thing. We're like, sure. I mean, if you're that excited that you're going to reach out through the website, we'll meet with you. And actually, we're having lunch with him this week to get a 6-month follow-up on where he is.
Oh, wow. So we've talked a lot, and I know earlier we talked a little bit about the lean startup, just, but let's talk about this different business models, right, that a startup can take on that may be a little different from the traditional. So what are some alternative business models that a startup can consider to enhance, their scalability? And why is this important in today's, what everything's going on right now?
So I think Todd probably wants me to tackle this one, because I have done a couple workshops on it. So when you think about a business model, it's really about thinking about the value proposition, and then how do you generate revenue? And I think a lot of times when we work with startups early on, they think that there's only one way to generate revenue. And the reality is that you can probably identify 25 or 30 different ways that you could generate revenue. And the business model canvas actually does a really nice job of highlighting what some of those are. We always have the razor, right? So the razor is very cheap, but you make all your money on the blades. We have the reverse, where the consumables are very cheap, but the razor is really expensive. We have the model, the Dollar Shave Club, where, it's a subscription. So every month they send you X number of them. It's all razors, right? It's just different ways to sell that razor. And so what we usually encourage people to do early on is to look at the 20-ish ways that you could go about generating money and think, what is the best 3 alternatives for my business? Because I just don't know until I get started what people are willing to pay for. I'll give you an example of an organization that is a training organization. And at first they had annual memberships. And then they realized that some people, didn't want to pay up front for a whole year, and they went to monthly memberships. Well, the memberships were much more popular, but then they had much more churn, right? So every business model has its own challenges that you have to think about. The freemium model, right? So let people test drive it and then they'll love it. Well, that only works if you have a way to convert people from the freemium to the upgrade. So every business model has its strengths and weaknesses, and each might be better in some situations, but not in other situations. The key really that we think about is just don't have a this is the only way it can happen model, right? Have the it could be this or that or the other thing model.
Yeah. So just coming back to our original premise and parts of the conversation where we were talking about product market fit, and that implies innovation comes on one of two dimensions: a new product or new features, or the customer that you're targeting. And those are certainly very important. But you've raised here a third dimension that interacts with those two and can be even unique in and of itself, which is the business model. Actually, how do you provide value and capture revenue from that opportunity? So you think about, Spotify or Pandora. They're not making music in a new way, but it's being packaged in a whole different way than it was when we were growing up buying, record albums and then moving to CDs, etc. So
what do you mean albums? You forgot about singles.
Yeah.
and my favorite 8-track tapes, right? So so the business model was really important. And I'm just going to throw out, not to get again too much in the weeds on it, but when you're thinking through that business model, there are three really important numbers to think about. The first one is customer acquisition cost. How much does it take to get a customer to put their hands up and say, yeah, I'm going to sign up for what you're offering? Okay. And you might be surprised, but even for a consumer product, you just can't build an app and people will flock to it. It'll cost you probably $150 to $300 or $400, depending on your market and who you're going after, using different types of marketing mechanisms just to get a customer. So what's the acquisition cost to get a customer? Second one is, what's the customer lifetime value? So how much do you expect them to spend on what you're offering? And by the way, doing simple math, if it costs you $200 to get a customer and you're only expecting to get $70 back from them, you're not going to be around for very long, right? It's a very simple equation. So you need to change one of those two dimensions. And then the third really important one, especially if you're doing like one of those monthly box things, right? That we all heard a lot about a few years ago. And that's the renewal rate. So how many customers actually continue to sign up to join? And those boxes had a pretty high customer acquisition cost. The lifetime value assumed that you were going to be with them for at least 5 years. But guess how many people actually renewed after 6 months of those renewal boxes? Because they started to see their funny dog toys piling up on their shelves, and were like, oh, okay, I'm done with that. So that renewal rate, you want to have at least 70-80%, and that is an important part of the equation. But if you can disentangle those three and do the math on them, that can help you pretty systematically come to a sense of what your business model is going to be and what you need to achieve to be scalable.
And that's interesting that you said it, because one of the examples that I just thought about is Amazon, where I not off the top of my head, I don't know what their acquisition cost was, but I know for at least 20 something years they were bleeding out. But because they understood, at least they explained it to their investors enough, the people that are putting money into Amazon, say, listen, the lifetime value outweighs all the money that we're willing to put into acquisition. Don't worry about it. It's going to pay itself. And now we see that was right, but that's not everyone. That's not every startup's, inception story or whatever, that they can get, people willing to invest that type of money for a long period of time, looking at just what the lifetime value of that customer would be. Because, now you look at Amazon, everyone that invested at that time was like, oh yeah, that was a great investment. It just took a while for it to come to fruition. So,
well, an awesome example too, because like, where did they start? Selling books and CDs, right? Something we're not doing a whole lot of consuming the way now. So
right, I was going to say, then they obsoleted it by giving you the Kindle to read instead of having the book, and then also Audible so that you could listen to it if you don't want to hold it or even read it.
But that kind of goes back to what you guys mentioned earlier, was that idea about I think you guys mentioned about an adventure that you guys are actually creating hardware, but that's kind of well, I'm seeing a lot of companies going like, think about Facebook, or excuse me, Meta, right?
Yeah.
So this idea that they brought out Oculus, right? Why? They came in with that became their first piece of hardware, this goggles. Now they're putting out more and more, so they have control. If you got a piece of hardware, it's like they understood where the attention was going. They understand where certain things are going, and they try to make sure that they get a certain profit share based off of it. But what they're taking in consideration is, doesn't matter necessarily on the front end of how much it's going to cost us to get this person. Once we get them into our ecosystem, the lifetime value outweighs all the disproportionate amount of money that we put out in other places. But that could be disastrous for a smaller startup or don't have the means to keep that up. Like, you can spend a whole lot of money in marketing at the beginning, but once that money dries up, then what are you going to do? Because now you can no longer require anyone to make the lifetime value worth anything.
Yeah, we definitely we can't think of Amazon as a startup at all. I mean, it's it's billions and billions and billions. So the rules are completely different. You have to look at them back when they were just selling books, right? And how did they get to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing? And it makes sense that if people are going to buy their books and CDs, that then now you have credibility as a shopping destination, and you can start to do other kinds of products, which the profits from those are what lead to the investments in those next things.
Okay, I agree. So let's talk about the lessons from the Titanic, because that's kind of like your guys' premise on that. So how the decision making process and startup parallel with those made during the launch of the Titanic? What could we learn from that?
So I'll start there. And the White Star Line, first of all, was founded actually to take people to not the United States gold rush, but the gold rush in Australia in the mid to late 1840s. So that's where the origins of the company came from. As they matured over the next decades, they moved toward having the fastest ships, first of all, and built a fleet, started doing runs to the United States. Ran into financial trouble several times, as many startups or growing companies do. Brought on a new investor. Guess what? That new investor said, I'm going to put in money, but you're going to use my nephew's shipyard. So after decades of using one shipyard, they had to change shipyards. So you go back to kind of the origins of where these organizations kind of come from, some decisions and how they can kind of interact with each other. That shipyard happened to be in a location where building even one, let alone, as Kim was saying, three, required, guess what holds steel together? It's these little things called rivets, right? And if you don't have enough high quality rivets, you start saying, we could probably cut a few corners, trim our costs, and we can get hundreds of thousands, millions of rivets that are this kind of slag material, which is a hybrid, not quite as strong. And we think if we put them over here in these bulkheads, okay, that's fine. Except if you hit an iceberg where those bulkheads are and you've got substandard rivets, that creates a problem, right? So the idea of all of these decisions, and we've shared some of them through our journey and discussion with you, but the investor dictating, we didn't mention the dining room and a single story dining room, as the marketer sat back and said, no, we want splendor. We want, well, you can't raise the ceiling on the dining room, right? The top is fixed. So what do? You go down. Guess what? That means your bulkheads that are the watertight compartments, they're shorter. So if one of them ruptures, the water spills over into the next compartment that much faster. So it was these interlocking decisions that were made to try and appeal to the consumer, increase value, and from a strategy perspective, shift from being one of the fastest to being one of the most luxurious, where your DNA is really about speed and the routes that you're taking, and not about building luxury. So a lot of change to accommodate, but also some very unfortunate lessons that hopefully fast forward we can learn from and help startups learn from into the future.
But as I said, we were just hearing Steve Case talk about the same thing. Like their first product was predicated on the idea that everybody wants a high quality modem instead of having a modem in a computer. So they had to jettison, thousands of pieces of hardware because by the time they got them out there, nobody wanted it. This story gets told over and over again. Every 4 or 5 years, we see another, okay, nobody wants this, so then they and they do, strategic partnerships. Well, who wants to be your strategic partner when you don't have anything? Right? I hear this all the time. Well, we're going to sell through others. Well, what are you going to sell? How are you going to be a partner? Why would they trust you? Right?
Exactly.
It's very hard for a startup.
Exactly. I think we lost Todd there. Oh, he might have went.
We lost Todd's computer. Todd, we can't see your camera. Don't know what's going on.
He might have stepped up. So real quick, Kim. So we're getting to the part where, if they're on the other side of this conversation, right? And someone was to come and say, all right, I'm a startup. I want to be able to create a compelling, positioning statement for my startup. How can startups create a positioning statement that not only, resonates, but also effectively markets and sells their product or service?
Yeah. So, I do an hour-long workshop to help startups go through this. So I'm going to boil it right down, So the key really is that so many people, when they are trying to create a product that they want to sell or marketing plans, they think about what they want and what's important to them. And the most important thing to recognize is that when people are going to give up money, they are hiring you to do a job, right? They're hiring that product for something. And so you have to understand, what is that job? What are they really trying to accomplish? It's more than just what problem are you solving, but what outcomes are they looking for? And to the extent that you can talk to them about the outcomes that they're going to achieve by using your product, then that's the magic. You want to be helping them see what the usefulness of it is, which also means that you have to be different from your competition. So, if they could use anybody to accomplish the same thing, then that's not really helpful. One of my favorite examples I love to give about this is, fast food. Think about fast food. It's meant to be fast, right? If you have to stand around at a fast food joint to get your food, it's very annoying. And you would think that, nobody could win on fast. But then you have Jimmy John's that comes along and is freaky fast. And I would say 95% of the time, that is my experience with them. Like, that was about the fastest I could get any food. It's sort of almost amazing. So that's what I mean. You have to understand, what are people really wanting? What outcomes are they looking for? And how can you help them see that you're going to accomplish those outcomes better or differently than any of the alternatives?
Todd, you got anything to share on that position?
No, but I think Kim hit on the important things that, certainly positioning is about what problem you're solving and who you're solving it for, but it's got to go beyond that. It's how you're differentiating. One thing I think a lot of startups neglect to think about is that their biggest competition might be non-consumption. It might be that either the customer doesn't recognize they have the problem, or they don't care enough about it that they've bought another solution or hired another solution to do that job for them. So recognizing the different sources of competition, direct as well as indirect, and then being able to differentiate yourself is really important. And just to start with, whether it's an investor or a customer, there's nobody else like us out there, isn't very compelling, because there could be a very good reason for why you're in the middle of that blue ocean.
So my last question to you guys is kind of like a hybrid, because I want to pull back from the earlier what we talked about when we talked about the business model exploration, but I think that's so important. But then I also want to tie that in with still the lean, the lean startup. What would be some of the things that you guys would like really stress above all to the listening audience right now? What will be some of those things that if you're if you could get any message to a CEO right now, any message to a co-founder or a founder of a startup, what would that, what would that be?
I'll give 2 starting points. One that we haven't really covered, which is know yourself. You have to know your strengths and weaknesses. What are you passionate about? What is your role in this organization that you're creating? There's nothing worse than, looking for having that freedom and not working for the big company and, and all of that. And then, 3 years later, you're miserable because you're working late and you're answering to everybody instead of one boss. And you're not doing something you love. So know yourself, know why you're getting into this, and be passionate about that process, and do a sanity check every once in a while and make sure you still care about that. But also knowing yourself means you know your weaknesses and you know where you need other team members to come in and help you. You know when you need to lean on your partner, your spouse, your family members. And communicate with them, bring them in. Don't hold them at arm's length because things aren't going well, because that can be a really long and tough journey. And then secondly, which I think is consistent with a lot of what we've talked about, know your market, know who it is that you're serving, understand the problem at a deep level that you're solving for them, and also what kind of outcomes they might be looking for. So those are a few of mine. Kim?
Yeah, so I think the one I always like to think about is move forward. Just don't get mired down in planning. Just get out of the building. Do something. Go talk to customers. I can't tell you how many people are frightened to go talk to customers. Oh man, you have to love to talk to customers. I mean, most of the time, nobody even asks them these questions. What are they doing? Why are they doing it? What problems do they still have? How can you solve those problems? And don't go and say, hey, do you like this to solve this problem? Go to them and ask them, what are the problems? And think with them about how to solve them.
Wow. That's all I can say. I think that's a lot of insight and a lot of information. And if you're just now tuning in, where have you been? But this is an opportunity for you to go back, listen to this. If you're a serious CEO, this show has been on for 9 years, and there's a reason for it, is because we're trying to give value back and show people there's a lot of fake gurus out there that's talking about this topic-based motivation and not really giving you insight and strategy. Today, look, we got Kim and Todd Saxon. These are, collegiate, professors. They're experts in their fields. And they're giving you insights about startups and how important it is for you to follow certain steps. So once again, I want to thank you guys. But before we tune out here, I want to ask you a question I asked everyone that's on the show. And that's one is, what do you want to be remembered for? And secondly, why?
All right, Todd, you get to go first so I can think about it.
Oh man. So this is going to get a little more personal. I want to be remembered as a good father, son, and partner. That's, while I care about this stuff, obviously I'm just a little bit passionate about some of these topics, and hope that there's been some positive impact on our communities at multiple levels. What I care most about, honestly, immediate family, and hoping that I've done right by them.
So I can't take that one. So I think, and Todd would probably say the same thing, it's really important us to be inspirational for the folks that we work with, our students, our alumni, the people in the community that we work with. You can accomplish a lot. Sometimes you can accomplish much more than you think you can. And so we try to empower you and push you and hold you to a expectation that might be even higher than you have for yourself, because we really think that you can do all that.
I'm going to add another small piece, Brandon, if you don't mind. Just that something else that we are passionate about is that as much as we say opportunity is out there for everyone, opportunity is differentially available because of structural inequities. It isn't easy for some people to find friends and family dollars. It isn't easy for some people to find a mentor who has been there and done that. And I think if we can help address some of the structural inequities and lead toward a more equitable distribution of opportunity, that is something that we're passionate about, and hopefully can put a small ding in, because it's a big problem.
And I agree. I would agree with you, Todd. But in the same breath, I always tell people, don't wait for opportunities. You have to create them. You have to go out, and there's a certain, and I know it's harder for, like you said, there's definitely a disparity in that case, but also we have to remind ourselves that we can't allow those things to cripple us. Like, yeah, there are, or there may be, for instance, there's institutional things that's in place, but what I've learned in my journey also is, don't allow those things to hinder you. Go out, connect with people. And I'm an old Art Williams guy, and he believes in this doing the right things. And if you do the right things for a long period of time, eventually it just becomes synonymous with who you are and the character that you have. And to me, I think that can rise above a lot of the inadequacies that a lot of minority-based entrepreneurs, like, by no means or measure am I saying that it's not harder or can be, and that there's things in place. But what I'm saying is that you want to go out and create those opportunities. Don't say that there are none because you're not willing to go out and create them. Don't wait for somebody to give you an opportunity. You got to create it. Like, I've created this opportunity. I reached out to you guys, like, you know what I'm saying? Like, so it's the idea of, you got to be willing to do something to get something, whether that's a startup, a business. You got to be willing to roll your sleeves up sometimes and get into the fight, So
Absolutely,
that's my 2 cents on it.
Yep.
So
it's more than just a dream, right? Do it.
Yeah,
that's part of your.
Yeah, and like I told you guys before, woo! Thank you guys for joining us, Forward Thinkers. What an incredible journey this has been today. A massive thank you to the doctors Todd and Kim Saxon for sharing their invaluable insights and strategies for startups. I hope you took copious notes and did all the things that was required. And also, we got the book here on the screen if you're looking on YouTube. And if you're not subscribed to us on YouTube, go to Cerebral AI. We're the future of business marketing. So I found today the episode enlightening. So don't forget to hit the subscribe button, share it with your network. Let's spread this wisdom about startups. Everyone wants to create new businesses. Everyone are coming up with startups, but they don't know exactly how to do it. So this episode that's the main, premise of it, is to help you with your startup. We've been up here over an hour now. And so I'm telling you, go back, rewind this. I can't keep reiterating that. Go back, rewind it, take notes if you're real serious about taking your business to the next level. And if you're real serious about it, go buy the book. Go check out their website. Kim, Todd, tell us about your website as well, because that's what's on the screen right now, where not only they can get the book, but I'm assuming they can connect with you, get coaching, consulting services. You guys have been in the fight. What better person or people to get that information from than you guys? Can you share a little bit of insight before we go ahead and close out?
Sure. The website is www.titaniceffect.com. The name, because of the book title, so Titanic Effect. There's some resources there, and you can reach out to us. We have some fun merch you can also buy if that excites you. But yeah, please do check it out and let us know what you think. There's the blogs. We've written, 100 blog posts, something like that. So ideas that go beyond the book that are more practical that you can absorb.
And we love to hear your stories. We love to hear, and there will be challenges. And if we can help you with those, Kim and I have what we call a 2 coffee rule that, we're public servants, right? The university pays us to in part to engage with the community. So whether that's Central Indiana or nationally or globally. So reach out, happy to do a Zoom session if you're not in our area, or meet with you, and just see if we can be helpful.
All right, guys. Thank you again for being a part of the show. And I'm Brandon L. Draper signing off and reminding you to always start thinking forward. Until next time, keep innovating, keep dreaming, keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible.